Berlin is a city that breathes history. Few places in Europe have experienced such frequent destruction, division, and rebirth. Nestled between the rivers Spree and Havel, the city embodies a unique juxtaposition of power and upheaval, splendor and ruins, past and future. Here, kings marched, revolutions raged, and wars rose and fell, shaping the world in profound ways. Today, Berlin stands as a powerful symbol of transformation, freedom, and the unwavering strength to start anew. This city, which never stands still, has learned that every destruction can also mark the beginning of something new. The story of Berlin begins along the banks of the Spree River, in a time when the land of Brandenburg was still cloaked in forests, swamps, and small trade routes. In the 12th century, as new towns emerged throughout Central Europe, a settlement began to take shape here that would soon become a center of commerce and power. However, the city that would later be known as Berlin was not initially a singular entity. It was actually comprised of two settlements, Berlin and Köln. Berlin arose on the eastern bank of the Spree, while Köln developed across the river. These two locations were interconnected by a wooden bridge, which not only spanned the river but also facilitated the movement of goods and people between the north and south, linking the trade routes of the Baltic Sea with those of Central Europe. This strategic location proved to be its greatest advantage, transforming the area into a hub where merchants, craftsmen, and travelers converged. The trade of furs, grains, salt, and cloth brought prosperity, leading both settlements to rapidly expand beyond their original boundaries. The first documented mention of Berlin dates back to the year 1237, a date now recognized as the official founding year of the city. In the historical document, a priest named Simeon from Köln is mentioned, indicating that organized communities already existed on both sides of the Spree. Only a few years later, the names of both settlements appear in other documents, confirming their status as significant trading locations at that time. The medieval settlements were small yet vibrant, characterized by narrow streets, half-timbered houses, and bustling marketplaces. Craftsmen worked within guilds, while traders organized themselves into merchant associations, offering goods from distant regions at the markets. The advantageous location along the Spree facilitated shipping and trade, while the surrounding forests and fields ensured a steady supply of resources. Berlin and Köln fell under the rule of the Brandenburg Margraves, who sought to assert their economic and political interests in the area. Nevertheless, both settlements enjoyed a certain degree of self-governance, a privilege that allowed them to form their own city councils and manage local affairs independently. This early sense of urban identity began to emerge, shaping the character of the city well into modern times. Despite their geographical proximity, Berlin and Köln functioned as distinct communities, often characterized by a blend of rivalry and cooperation. Each settlement constructed its own churches, markets, and fortifications, reflecting their individual identities. However, the river that separated them also served as a vital artery, connecting them and providing a shared foundation for their development. It was along both banks of this river that the initial seed of what would eventually become the capital of an empire was planted. From the dual settlement of the 13th century, a bustling urban center gradually emerged, attracting merchants, pilgrims, and craftsmen from across the northern German region. Little did anyone suspect that this unassuming location along the river would one day evolve into one of the most significant stages in European history. The narrative of Berlin began with the establishment of early charters, the construction of walls, and the creation of markets, marking the beginning of a chapter that would ultimately change the world. In the pivotal year of 1307, a significant step was taken that would profoundly influence the city's development. Berlin and Köln united under a common administration. While both locations retained their formal independence, they now formed a political and economic entity, an alliance that was intended to ensure stability and influence. This union was not merely a symbolic gesture, but rather a pragmatic decision aimed at managing shared obligations, organizing defense, and resolving conflicts between the citizenry. The backdrop of this development was representative of the era. Trade flourished, and the region gained prominence. Merchants from Lübeck, Stendal, and Magdeburg traveled by land and water to this dual city, which had by then become part of the Hanseatic League. The combination of two harbors, two markets, and two administrative systems promised economic strength, yet the overlapping structures also led to tensions. The joint administration sought to alleviate these issues by regulating the rights and responsibilities of both parties. Politically, the city remained under the authority of the Brandenburg Margraves, yet its self-governance was significantly bolstered. A joint council, composed of representatives from both cities, took on the responsibility of important tasks, ranging from market regulation to tax collection and judicial matters. This early form of municipal cooperation was unusual in Central Europe, positioning Berlin-Cologne as a model of urban organization in the region. The union not only fostered economic prosperity, but also encouraged cultural integration. Families that had previously lived on opposite sides of the river began to connect through trade and marriage. Craft guilds collaborated across the riverbanks, leading to an increase in the exchange of ideas and goods. Gradually, a shared urban consciousness began to take shape, a sense of community that transcended individual identities. Thus, this year laid the groundwork for the Berlin we know today, a city rich in history and significance. The decision to unite was not a spectacular event, yet it transformed two small trading posts into a burgeoning urban organism. Along the banks of the Spree River, interests, structures, and individuals merged into a cohesive entity, the significance of which was yet to be realized by anyone. However, with this pivotal step, Berlin began to grow beyond its banks, embarking on a journey to become the political heart of Brandenburg and, eventually, all of Prussia. At the dawn of the 15th century, Berlin stood at a critical juncture in its history. Once merely a dual settlement along the Spree, it had evolved into a significant trading city, its influence extending far beyond the borders of the Mark Brandenburg. Nevertheless, the political landscape of the region was fraught with instability. Power struggles among noble families, economic crises, and the rising importance of territorial lords characterized this tumultuous era. It was within this context that a dynasty emerged, destined to shape the history of Berlin for centuries, the Hohenzollerns. In the year 1415, King Sigismund of Luxembourg ceded the Mark Brandenburg to Friedrich V of Nuremberg. This transfer granted Friedrich the electoral dignity, the right to participate in the election of the Holy Roman Emperor, and he became known as Friedrich I, the first elector of Brandenburg. With his ascension began the rule of the Hohenzollerns, a dynasty that would endure for nearly 5 centuries. From the regional capital along the Spree, they would mold the nucleus of a powerful state. Until that time, Berlin had been a confident trading city with extensive privileges. Now it was transformed into a political residence. The presence of the elector and his court fundamentally altered life in the city. Previously dominated by merchants and craftsmen, the urban landscape was now shaped by court officials, clergy, and soldiers. While the marketplace remained the focal point of civic life, the power of the territorial lord increasingly loomed over it. Friedrich and his successors utilized Berlin as the seat of their government and as a symbol of their consolidating power. Throughout the 15th century, they commissioned the construction of castles and administrative buildings, which served as visible markers of their claims. At the same time, they sought to curtail the influence of the city's citizens. The Berliners, who had relied on their urban rights and freedoms, now faced a centralized authority that showed little regard for local self-governance. These tensions culminated in an open conflict known as the Berlin discontent. When Elector Friedrich P., also called Iron Tooth, proposed the construction of a new palace, the citizens vehemently opposed it. They feared that their rights would be further restricted and that the city would ultimately be reduced to a mere residence rather than remaining a free trading hub. The uprising was quelled, and the palace construction proceeded, marking a clear indication that the era of urban independence had come to an end. Despite these conflicts, the rule of the Hohenzollerns also brought a measure of stability to the region. The city began to gain prominence as an administrative center, enhancing its significance in terms of craftsmanship and trade. The burgeoning demand from the court, coupled with new construction projects, transformed the urban landscape of Berlin. Churches, fortifications, and residential houses emerged, while the Spree River was developed into one of the most important transportation routes in the northern part of the empire, featuring bridges and storage facilities. With Berlin's designation as the residence city of the Brandenburg electors, a close relationship was forged between the city and the dynasty that would shape its identity like no other. From this strategic location, the Hohenzollerns directed their affairs, first over Brandenburg, later over Prussia, and ultimately over the German Empire. What began as a prosperous trading city evolved into the political center of an aspiring territorial state. The pivotal moment in the year 1415 transformed Berlin into more than just a hub of commerce. It became the capital of an idea that would alter the course of Europe in the centuries to come. As the 16th century unfolded, the teachings of Martin Luther began to reverberate throughout the Holy Roman Empire. Originating from Wittenberg, the Reformation also took hold in Brandenburg and thus in Berlin. The year 1539 marked a significant turning point. In that year, Elector Joachim officially introduced Protestantism, a move that would fundamentally change the religious, cultural, and political life of the city for generations. Years prior, reformist ideas had already begun to spread in Berlin, as well as in various regions across Germany. Preachers familiar with Luther's writings gained influence, particularly among urban craftsmen and merchants. Many viewed the new doctrine as a liberation from ecclesiastical oversight, a return to a more direct form of faith. The demand for sermons in the German language, for translations of the Bible, and for a simpler form of worship found increasing support. Initially, the Brandenburg electors responded with caution. Joachim the Selle, the father of the later reformer Joachim the Selle, remained steadfastly committed to Catholicism and tolerated no deviation from it. However, his son, more pragmatic and open-minded, recognized that the Reformation was not merely a matter of faith, but also presented a political opportunity. By embracing the new doctrine, he could strengthen his power over the Church, transfer ecclesiastical property into state administration, and solidify the authority of the electors over spiritual matters. On the 1st of November, 1539, which coincided with Reformation Day, a symbolic act of conversion took place at St. Nicholas Church in Berlin. The Brandenburg court participated collectively in a Protestant communion service, a gesture that resonated throughout the Mark. The Mass was celebrated in the German language, communion was offered in both kinds, and the Catholic clergy lost its previously dominant position within the religious landscape. This pivotal moment marked the beginning of a new era for Berlin, intertwining its fate with the transformative currents of the Reformation. For Berlin, the introduction of the Reformation signified a profound transformation. Monasteries and convents were dissolved, their properties nationalized or repurposed for new functions. Schools, hospitals, and almshouses came under the oversight of the electorate. The focus shifted from the Roman Catholic Church to a regional church that was closely linked with the authorities. This intertwining of religion and state became a defining characteristic of Brandenburg Prussian history. Concurrently, Protestantism fostered education and a culture of literacy. Vernacular Bibles, hymnals, and pamphlets found their way into Berlin, marking a significant cultural shift. schools gained greater importance, as it was now expected that every believer should read the Bible for themselves. The language also underwent a transformation. Martin Luther's early New High German became the standard for administration and education. However, this transition was not universally peaceful. Segments of the population clung to the old faith, and in rural areas resistance emerged. Even within the new faith, tensions arose between Lutheran and Reformed factions. Nevertheless, Protestantism fully established itself in the following decades, shaping the spiritual life of the city for centuries to come. With the Reformation, a new epoch began for Berlin. The city emerged as a center for a faith that emphasized education, discipline, and obedience, values that would later become closely associated with the Prussian understanding of statehood. Thus, the introduction of Protestantism was more than merely a religious act. It laid the groundwork for a culture in which church and state were intricately intertwined, and where faith became both a source of order and a fundamental part of self-identity. In the churches of Berlin, where once Latin masses had resounded, now echoed the German hymns of the Reformation, heralding the sound of a new era. As the 30 Years' War broke out, no one could foresee that it would plunge Central Europe into one of the darkest catastrophes in its history. What began as a conflict over religion soon escalated into a power struggle involving princes, kingdoms, and foreign powers. This war ravaged entire regions, depopulated cities, and shattered the social fabric. Berlin was not spared from this devastation. The city, which had grown steadily in the preceding decades, was driven to the brink of ruin during this tumultuous period. At the war's onset, Brandenburg was formally aligned with the Protestants. However, Elector Georg Wilhelm attempted to maintain a stance of neutrality. His hesitance would prove to be a grave miscalculation. As the marauding armies of the Imperial and Swedish forces swept through the land, Brandenburg became a battleground, plundered and ravaged by both sides. Berlin itself, lacking significant fortifications, could hardly escape the unfolding chaos. The city's inhabitants suffered from hunger, deprivation, and constant requisitions, enduring a grim existence amidst the turmoil. Groups demanded food, shelter, and money, while trade and craftsmanship nearly came to a standstill. Many people fled to the countryside or took refuge in the forests. Others succumbed to the effects of illness and deprivation. Entire streets stood empty, and the once vibrant sounds of the markets faded into silence. Contemporary reports described destroyed houses, neglected churches, and a city where only a fraction of the original population remained. Berlin faced particularly harsh conditions during the occupation by the Swedish forces in the year 1630. Following the victory of King Gustavus Adolphus at the Battle of Breitenfeld, his army marched through Brandenburg, compelling the local populace to join the Protestant cause. The city was forced to pay exorbitant contributions, surrender supplies, and accommodate soldiers. As a result, the population fell into poverty, while diseases such as plague and typhus spread unchecked. As the war dragged on for decades, the population of Berlin drastically declined. From around 30,000 people before the war, only a few thousand remained by the year 1648. The city walls crumbled. The streets were littered with debris and refuse, and the intellectual and cultural life of the city came to a near standstill. The prosperity of the pre-war era had vanished, and trust in authority and the church was severely shaken. When the Peace of Westphalia was signed in 1648, an atmosphere of exhaustion enveloped Berlin. Although the city was not completely destroyed like some other places, it was drained of life, bled dry, and economically ruined. The decades of uncertainty had left deep scars on the psyche of its inhabitants. The 30 Years' War marked a significant turning point for Berlin, highlighting how vulnerable the city was despite its strategic location and importance. From the ruins, a new Berlin would eventually rise, characterized by frugality, discipline, and a longing for stability. However, in the midst of the 17th century, none of this was yet apparent. Instead, there was only the silence of a city that had survived the war, but had lost almost everything in the process. When the 30 Years' War finally came to an end, Brandenburg lay in ruins. Cities, villages, and fields were devastated, the population had been decimated, and the economy was in shambles. During this time of decline, Frederick William, the future Great Elector, took over the government in the year 1640 and made Berlin the starting point of an unprecedented reconstruction effort. Under his rule, the ravaged city gradually transformed into the political and economic center of a resurgent state. The Elector, shaped by the experiences of war, understood that Brandenburg could only survive if it modernized, strengthened its economy, and established a reliable administration. To achieve this, he needed a capital that embodied these aspirations. Berlin was to no longer be a symbol of destruction, but rather a beacon of order, discipline, and renewal. The first task was to make the city habitable once again. Streets were repaired, markets reopened, and the organization of food supply was set in motion. The Elector actively promoted the reconstruction of crafts and trade. He attracted merchants and skilled workers by offering them tax relief and protective privileges. The population, which had significantly dwindled during the war, began to grow once more, not least due to immigrants from neighboring regions who sought new opportunities in Berlin. A particularly significant step was the settlement of the Huguenots. Following the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in the year 1685, tens of thousands of French Protestants fled persecution in their homeland. Frederick William recognized this opportunity and offered them refuge. With the Potsdam Edict, he invited them to settle in Brandenburg, and many chose to come to Berlin. The Huguenots brought with them knowledge, craftsmanship, capital, and new ideas. They established manufactories, introduced innovative techniques in textile and metal processing, and culturally and economically shaped urban life. Within just a few decades, they played a crucial role in the city's revival. Berlin also underwent significant urban development under the Great Elector. New fortifications were constructed, canals were dug, and warehouses were built. The expansion of trade routes made the city a vital hub between East and West. Simultaneously, a gradual refinement of the cityscape began. Stone houses gradually replaced the old wooden structures, and the construction of the palace, initiated by Frederick's predecessors, was continued and expanded, a visible symbol of electoral power. The policies of the Great Elector also laid the groundwork for a more centralized state. The Brandenburg provinces became more closely tied to Berlin, with administration and finances organized centrally. As a result, the city emerged as the firm residence of the Elector, not only serving as the seat of power, but also embodying the essence of a new modern state. At the same time, Frederick William promoted religious tolerance. In an era when Europe was still torn apart by confessional tensions, he granted protection to various religious communities as long as they remained loyal to the state. This stance attracted further migrants. Dutch, Polish, Bohemian, and Baltic people found their way to Berlin, contributing to the city's cultural diversity. By the time the Great Elector passed away in the year 1688, Berlin had fundamentally transformed. From a destitute post-war settlement, it had evolved into a thriving residence animated by trade, characterized by immigration, and supported by an administration that operated with newfound efficiency. The city began to develop that Prussian identity which would define it in the centuries to come: disciplined, industrious, pragmatic, and open to new ideas. The reconstruction under Frederick William was more than just the renewal of a city, it marked the beginning of a new era. It was a profound emergence from destruction, a resolute act of will that laid the foundation for what would later become Prussia. In the newly rebuilt streets and workshops of Berlin, a new era began to unfold, one in which the city would gradually evolve into what it would remain for centuries, the heart of an ambitious and self-forming state. In the 18th century, under the reign of Frederick Idol, who would be immortalized in history as Frederick the Great. Berlin experienced a remarkable renaissance. The city, once scarred by wars and reconstruction, transformed into the cultural, political, and intellectual epicenter of the Prussian state. Under the rule of this king, who was equally a philosopher and a military commander, Berlin emerged as a symbol of the Enlightenment, a place where power and intellect, discipline and culture harmoniously converged. Frederick ascended to the throne in the year 1740, at a time when Prussia was gaining military strength yet remained overshadowed culturally by other European courts. He was determined to change this dynamic. Inspired by Enlightenment ideals and influenced by French rationalism, he saw himself as the first servant of the state and a patron of the arts and sciences. Under his leadership, Berlin was to become not only the capital of a well-organized state, but also a center of intellectual freedom and education. In the early years of his reign, Frederick began to architecturally renew and beautify the city. Under his guidance, structures emerged that continue to define the cityscape to this day. The State Opera on Unter den Linden, the Hedwig Church, the Royal Library, and numerous palaces transformed the boulevard into a magnificent thoroughfare stretching from the palace to the city gate, a testament to Prussian order and royal representation. Simultaneously, Frederick championed science and education. He revitalized the Berlin Academy of Sciences, attracting scholars and philosophers from across Europe, the most notable among them being the French thinker Voltaire, whom Frederick invited to his court. At Sanssouci, his summer residence in Potsdam, the king engaged in discussions with Voltaire and other intellectuals on philosophy, religion, and governance, a remarkable fusion of power and intellect for that era. However, the Enlightenment in Berlin was not merely a mimicry of French models. It took on a distinct, sober, and practical character. Education, science, and administration were to serve the common good, rather than the luxury or vanity of the ruler. Frederick expanded schools, modernized administration, and continued the tolerance policies initiated by his great-grandfather. Catholics, Reformed Christians, and Jews were granted extensive religious freedoms, an unusual step in a time still heavily marked by confessional divisions. Despite these advancements, Berlin remained a city of contrasts, embodying both the aspirations and the challenges of its time. While philosophers and artists were celebrated at the royal court, strict order prevailed among the lower classes. The king himself intervened in all areas, from architecture to theater criticism, demanding discipline in both administration and the military. This blend of control and encouragement transformed Berlin into a city where the Prussian ideal became tangible. Values such as frugality, a strong work ethic, a sense of duty, and education as the foundation of progress flourished. Under the reign of Frederick the Great, Berlin evolved into a magnet for artists, musicians, and intellectuals. Notable figures such as the architect Knobelsdorff, the composer Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, and the philosopher Moses Mendelssohn contributed to Berlin's cultural radiance, which extended beyond the borders of Prussia. Mendelssohn, in particular, a prominent representative of the Jewish Enlightenment, turned the city into a hub of intellectual tolerance, fostering new modes of thought. By the time Frederick passed away in the year 1786, Berlin had transformed into not only the capital of a militarily powerful state, but also one that was intellectually robust. The Prussian capital had evolved from a provincial residence into a center of European enlightenment. The connection of discipline and intellect, of order and reason that emerged during Frederick's rule shaped the image of Berlin for generations to come. With Frederick the Great, an era began where Berlin aspired to be more than just a seat of power. It became a city of ideas, a place where the spirit of the Enlightenment intertwined with the rigor of the Prussian state. This legacy remained deeply rooted in the city's self-understanding, establishing Berlin as one of the most significant cultural centers in Europe. However, in the autumn of the year 1806, as Napoleon's cannons thundered on Prussian soil, Berlin faced one of the greatest humiliations in its history. The Prussian army, long praised for its discipline and invincibility, suffered a devastating defeat at the battles of Jena and Ostend. Just weeks later, French troops marched into the capital. On the 27th of October, Napoleon himself passed through the Brandenburg Gate, a symbol that would be etched into the memory of the city. The occupation of Berlin was more than a mere military event. It signified the collapse of the old Prussia, a state that had relied on rigid obedience, noble privileges, and an outdated military system. The French rule starkly illuminated for Prussian society how far it had lagged behind the modern ideas circulating throughout Europe. Yet, from this humiliation emerged a new dynamism that would transform Berlin and all of Prussia. The occupation period was harsh. French soldiers took up residence in private homes, demanding taxes, food, and accommodation. Public buildings were looted, and many Berliners experienced daily life under foreign rule with bitterness and anger. This tumultuous chapter in Berlin's history would ultimately sow the seeds for a future marked by resilience and transformation. Napoleon Bonaparte treated the city of Berlin with a marked sense of superiority. He famously visited the tomb of Frederick the Great in Potsdam and, according to tradition, stood before it with a sense of awe and reverence. This gesture evoked a mix of admiration and resentment among the people of Berlin. However, while external freedom appeared to be lost, a profound spiritual awakening began to unfold within the city. Many Prussian officials, military officers, and scholars recognized that the state could only regain its strength through comprehensive reform. As Berlin remained the administrative heart of Prussia, the ideas for a sweeping renewal began to take shape. Influential figures such as Karl Freiherr von Stein, Karl August von Hardenberg, and Gerhard von Scharnhorst devised plans to modernize the old Prussian state across economic, military, and social dimensions. The so-called Stein-Hardenberg reforms profoundly transformed the nation. Serfdom was abolished. The bourgeoisie was granted new rights, and the education system underwent significant reform. Berlin was at the center of these developments. It was here that Wilhelm von Humboldt founded the University of Berlin in the year 1810, which would later be known as Humboldt University. This institution became a symbol of the new Prussian spirit, emphasizing education, reason, and responsibility. Concurrently, a new sense of national consciousness began to emerge in the city. Under French occupation, intellectuals and citizens started to become aware of their shared identity. Writers, philosophers, and musicians created works imbued with themes of patriotism and the desire for freedom. In the salons of Berlin, particularly in the renowned Salon of Rahel, Warren Hagen, scholars, poets, and politicians gathered to discuss the future of Germany. Following the withdrawal of French troops in 1814 and the subsequent wars of liberation against Napoleon, Berlin underwent a definitive transformation. The defeat had shattered the old Prussian state, yet it also paved the way for a new beginning. The concept of the citizen, who was not merely a subject but a part of a nation, began to solidify. Thus, the Napoleonic occupation became a paradoxical turning point. It brought destruction and humiliation, but also renewal and self-reflection. In Berlin, a new consciousness emerged, one that would lay the foundation for modern Prussia and eventually the German nation-state in the decades to come. From the experience of foreign rule arose a strong will for reform, and from the disgrace of defeat emerged a pride that would accompany the city on its future path. The 19th century saw Berlin undergo a transformation unlike any it had experienced in its previous history. The old residence city of the House of Hohenzollern evolved into a vibrant metropolis filled with machines, smokestacks, and workshops, becoming a symbol of the Industrial Revolution in Germany. What began with a few small workshops and manufactories swiftly transformed within a matter of decades into a city resonating with the sounds of factories, railways, and electric power. Following the Napoleonic Wars, Prussia embarked on a path of economic modernization. The reforms of the early mid-century, the expansion of the educational system, and an increasing liberalization of trade laid the groundwork for significant economic growth. Berlin, which had long held a central political and administrative position within the kingdom, naturally became the focal point of this development. A crucial turning point was the city's connection to the railway network. In the year 1838, the first railway line from Berlin to Potsdam opened, marking the dawn of a new era. From that moment on, the city experienced rapid growth, evolving into a transportation hub that linked northern and southern Germany, as well as the east and west. Train stations such as Anhalter, Stettner, and Hamburger Bahnhof became gateways to an industrializing world. With the arrival of the railways came raw materials, machinery, laborers, and an entirely new way of life. Numerous industrial enterprises established themselves in the city, including machine factories, chemical works, textile, and metal industries. Names like Borsig, Siemens, and Egg became symbols of technological advancement. Above all, the field of electrical engineering transformed Berlin into the electropolis of Europe, a city that, by the early 20th century, was regarded as one of the most modern in the world. Street lighting, electric trams, and telegraph networks turned what was once a quiet residence town into a dynamic industrial metropolis. However, progress came at a cost. The economic boom resulted in a massive population influx. People from Silesia, Pomerania, Mecklenburg, and East Prussia flocked to the city in search of work. The population skyrocketed from approximately 200,000 to over 1.5 million by the century's end. Entire neighborhoods sprang up in no time, often under challenging conditions. In the tenement buildings of the working-class districts, families lived in cramped quarters, while in the bourgeois neighborhoods, grand boulevards, theaters, and museums flourished. Berlin became a mirror reflecting the social tensions of the industrial age, where wealth and poverty coexisted side by side. On one hand, there were the splendid streets of the new bourgeoisie. On the other, the backyards and factory districts where daily life was marked by long working hours and meager wages. These stark contrasts shaped the political culture of the city and fostered the emergence of an organized labor movement that would soon become a significant social force. At the same time, Berlin remained a place of progress and innovation. Technical schools, scientific institutes, and art academies emerged, and the city developed into a center for engineering, architecture, and culture. New infrastructures such as gasworks, water pipes, and public transportation systems transformed Berlin into a laboratory of modernity. By the end of the 19th century, Berlin had evolved beyond being merely the capital of Prussia. It emerged as a symbol of the industrial and social upheaval that swept across Europe. The smoke from factories, the clattering of trains, and the hum of electric lines became the soundtrack of this new era. Once shaped by electors and kings, the city was now dictated by the rhythm of machines. This transformation epitomized the modern age, establishing Berlin as the leading metropolis of Germany. When the German Empire was proclaimed in Versailles in the year 1871, a new era began for Berlin. The proclamation of the Kaiser in the Hall of Mirrors of the French Palace elevated the Prussian residence to the capital of a united Germany, becoming the political, economic, and cultural center of an empire poised to become Europe's leading power. For the city situated by the Spree River, this elevation meant far more than just a title. It triggered a tremendous upswing that would forever alter its landscape. At that time, Berlin was already the largest city in the Kingdom of Prussia and a significant industrial and administrative hub. However, a new unprecedented dynamism was set in motion. As the capital of the new empire, the city attracted politicians, civil servants, entrepreneurs, and intellectuals from all corners of Germany. Ministries, authorities, and military institutions emerged, and with them grew the demand for housing, schools, theaters, and transportation links. The city transformed into a metropolis whose growth was nearly uncontrollable. New districts sprang up around the historic center, particularly in the west and north. The boulevards under the linden trees and Friedrichstrasse became symbols of urban life, while entire residential neighborhoods emerged in Charlottenburg, Schöneberg, and Wilmersdorf. The economic boom of the empire was reflected immediately in the city. Factories, banks, and trading houses flourished. Berlin became the nexus of German capitalism, the command center of industry and finance. Grand construction projects reshaped the cityscape. The completion of the Reichstag symbolized the new political role of the city. At the same time, magnificent train stations, museums, and theaters emerged, establishing Berlin as the cultural center of the empire. However, the transformation was not merely superficial. With its new role as the capital, the self-confidence of Berliners grew. The city developed a distinct identity characterized by vigor, wit, and a rough pride that soon became proverbial. The Berlin dialect, direct, humorous, and sometimes irreverent, became an expression of this new urban culture that formed between factory halls and palaces, bridging the gap between Prussian discipline and burgeoning modernity. At the same time, the rapid growth of Berlin revealed its darker aspects. The swiftly increasing population led to a severe housing shortage, giving rise to significant social tensions. While the bourgeoisie could afford splendid homes in the newly developed districts, working-class families found themselves crammed into tenement buildings that offered little light and fresh air. The stark contrast between wealth and poverty became a defining characteristic of the capital, foreshadowing the social conflicts that would shape the coming century. Nevertheless, during this period, a palpable sense of new beginnings permeated the city. Berlin was no longer merely the residence of the Hohenzollerns. It had transformed into a symbol of a resurgent German greatness. The city embodied the self-confidence of a unified empire, which viewed itself as both an industrial and cultural powerhouse. By the end of the 19th century, Berlin had ascended to become the fourth largest city in the world, a metropolis of international significance. Electric trams traversed the streets, boulevards shimmered in the glow of gas lamps, and the Brandenburg Gate, once a royal emblem, had now become the iconic symbol of an entire empire. With the founding of the German Empire, Berlin had definitively established its role as the heart of a new Germany, serving as a stage for power and as a city that uniquely personified the contradictions between splendor and hardship, progress and overwhelming challenges. The Gründerzeit or founding era marked a period of grand bourgeois architecture. Entire neighborhoods were meticulously redesigned. Charlottenburg, Tiergarten, Schöneberg, and Wilmersdorf transformed into elegant residential areas, characterized by wide streets, stately apartment buildings, and ornate facades. Sturdy columns, bay windows, and balconies adorned the structures, and construction flourished as if there were no tomorrow. The Grand Boulevard, Unter den Linden, became the showcase of the capital, flanked by museums, theaters, ministries, and palaces. Additionally, Potsdamer Platz and Alexanderplatz evolved into vibrant centers of modern urban life. Yet behind this facade of glamour lay a different reality. The rapid growth had attracted hundreds of thousands of workers to the city, who resided in the newly erected tenements of the working-class districts. In cramped backyards, often devoid of light, water, or hygiene, families shared tiny living spaces. Illness, unemployment, and social insecurity became part of everyday life. While the bourgeoisie leisurely strolled along the new boulevards, the majority struggled for daily survival. These stark contrasts turned Berlin into a focal point of the social question. Trade unions and workers' associations began to emerge. The Social Democratic Party gained influence, and strikes became increasingly common. The industrial capital of the empire was simultaneously a center for political movements advocating for co-determination, labor rights, and social justice. Despite all the tensions, Berlin during these years also flourished as a city of culture and progress, with theaters, opera houses, and variety shows experiencing a remarkable boom. Writers such as Theodor Fontane and artists like Adolf Menzel profoundly influenced the intellectual climate of Berlin, while a surge of new newspapers and illustrated magazines catered to the growing public's thirst for information. The city transformed into a vibrant hub of noise, energy, and change, a place that was perpetually in motion. Technological innovations ushered in a new era of urban living. The introduction of gas lighting, electricity, streetcars, and telephones revolutionized daily life. Simultaneously, new public buildings, schools, hospitals, and universities began to emerge, reflecting the city's aspirations for modernization. As Berlin began to rise vertically, so too did the collective sentiment of having entered a new age. The era of the German Empire endowed Berlin with the character of a world city, serving as a grand stage for imperial splendor. This ambition was particularly pronounced under Kaiser Wilhelm IX, who asserted that Berlin deserved to be elevated to the status of a global metropolis. Monumental constructions, such as the Victory Column, the expanded Berlin Palace, and the Berlin Cathedral, vividly illustrated this aspiration. However, as the city's grandeur expanded, so did the societal fractures that festered beneath the surface. By the close of the 19th century, Berlin had evolved into a city of extremes, rich and poor, powerful and torn apart, modern yet rife with contradictions. The clamor of factories blended with the sounds emanating from opera houses. The shiny boulevards cast shadows over dark alleyways. It was a time of upheaval and tension, an epoch in which Berlin became a symbol of modernity, yet also a battleground where the social conflicts of the new industrial society intensified. Following the conclusion of the First World War, Berlin found itself at the epicenter of an entirely new era. The empire had collapsed, the Kaiser had fled, and the streets of the capital became a stage for heated debates about Germany's future. In November 1918, Philipp Scheidemann proclaimed the Republic from the balcony of the Reichstag, and only hours later, Karl Liebknecht did the same, albeit in the name of a socialist republic. Thus, Berlin became the setting for the birth pangs of the Weimar Republic, a democracy that emerged amidst chaos, hope, and despair. The initial years were marked by unrest, street battles, coup attempts, and political assassinations shook the city to its core. The revolution of 1918, brutally suppressed, left deep rifts between the left and the right. The Spartacus uprising, the murders of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, the Kapp Putsch, and countless strikes illustrated that Berlin was more than just the seat of government. It was the political heart of the nation, a heart that beat irregularly. Yet, while the Republic remained politically unstable, Berlin developed into one of the most exciting cultural centers in Europe. The city, which had suffered during the war, awakened to become a laboratory of modernity. Art, literature, theater, music, and science flourished in an unprecedented atmosphere of freedom during the vibrant years of the 1920s. This decade transformed Berlin into a metropolis of the avant-garde, epitomizing the so-called Golden Twenties. Influential artists such as Bertolt Brecht, George Grosz, and Otto Dix redefined the landscape of art with their provocative, critical, and unfiltered expressions. In the realm of theater, Erwin Piscator experimented with political productions that challenged conventional narratives, while cinema emerged as a groundbreaking medium, experiencing its own renaissance. The UFA studios in Babelsberg produced films that achieved international acclaim, including Fritz Lang's iconic work, Metropolis. Simultaneously, Berlin became a magnet for intellectuals from around the globe. Writers, philosophers, and journalists flocked to the city, drawn by a level of freedom that was scarcely found elsewhere in Europe. The nightlife of Berlin became emblematic of this era, characterized by an exuberant atmosphere in theaters, cabarets, and dance halls. After enduring the hardships of the war, people sought a renewed sense of life through entertainment and excess. Venues such as the Mokafti and the El Dorado Club emerged as vibrant centers of urban life, a place where glamour, decadence, and despair coexisted. However, beneath the surface glamour of these years lay a profound sense of uncertainty. The economic crisis of the Weimar Republic hit Berlin particularly hard. Inflation, mass unemployment, and political radicalization shaped the daily lives of countless individuals. The global economic downturn of 1929 forced factories to shut down, leading to widespread poverty and hunger in working-class neighborhoods. At the same time, political polarization intensified, with communists and national socialists engaging in violent street battles while the democratic center grew increasingly fragile. Despite these tensions, Berlin remained a global intellectual hub during this tumultuous period. It was here that the renowned physicist Albert Einstein made his contributions, and where Max Reinhardt directed groundbreaking theatrical productions. Thinkers such as Walter Benjamin, Siegfried Kracauer, and Theodor W. Adorno engaged in profound discussions about the future of society. This concentration of creativity and intellectualism rendered the city a symbol of the modern world, reflecting its inherent contradictions. However, when the National Socialists seized power in 1933, this vibrant chapter came to an abrupt end. Many artists, scientists, and intellectuals were forced into exile, while others faced persecution or death. The cultural blossoming of Berlin extinguished in a remarkably short time. The city, which had thrived on the dream of freedom, now plunged into the darkness of dictatorship. The years of the Weimar Republic had transformed Berlin into a unique metropolis, renowned for its diversity, creativity, and dynamism. It served as both a stage and a lens through which the hopes and fears of an entire era were manifested. This period, marked by the tension between avant-garde and abyss, freedom and despair, continues to shape the image of the city to this day. With the arrival of 1933, Berlin entered one of the darkest epochs in its history. The political freedom that had transformed the city during the years of the Weimar Republic into a beacon of intellectual awakening was abruptly stifled. Within mere months, Berlin transitioned from a vibrant metropolis of modernity to a center of totalitarian power. The dictatorship that took root here exerted control over every aspect of life, politics, culture, science, and the private lives of individuals. Soon after the regime's rise to power, oppression and enforced conformity began. Political opponents, labor unions, and independent media were systematically silenced, while democratic institutions were dismantled. Berlin, once a city rich with diverse voices and opinions, devolved into a place characterized by silence and fear. The Reichstag building, a symbol of parliamentary democracy, became emblematic of the end of freedom following the fire in 1933. Concurrently, a systematic exclusion and persecution of specific population groups commenced. The Jewish community, which had contributed significantly to the cultural, scientific, and economic life of the city for centuries, faced disenfranchisement and expulsion. The infamous Nuremberg laws stripped them of the very foundations of existence. Businesses were shuttered, homes were confiscated, and countless individuals were abducted. In Berlin, collection camps and deportation centers emerged, from which thousands were sent to their deaths. The cityscape transformed dramatically during these years. Grand construction projects were envisioned to architecturally manifest the regime's power. Monumental axes, parade grounds, and representative buildings were planned to establish Berlin as the capital of a dreamed empire. Many of these ambitious plans remained unfinished, yet they vividly illustrate the megalomania of that era. With the onset of the war in 1939, Berlin became the nerve center for military and political decisions, while simultaneously becoming a target for Allied bombings. In the factories of the city, hundreds of thousands of forced laborers toiled under inhumane conditions. Gradually, entire neighborhoods morphed into landscapes of ruins. The population lived amidst air raid shelters, rationing, and relentless propaganda, a society where fear and hopelessness dictated daily life. As the war dragged on, destruction increasingly took center stage. From 1943 onward, massive air raids began obliterating entire streets. Churches, museums, residential buildings, and historic structures were annihilated. The former splendor of the capital vanished beneath rubble and ash. Millions fled, while others struggled to survive in the debris. By the spring of 1945, the war finally reached Berlin itself. The city became the battleground for the final clashes. Houses, bridges, and entire districts lay in ruins as the guns finally fell silent. The capitulation marked the end of the dictatorship, but also the complete destruction of what was once a thriving metropolis. As silence descended over the ruins of Berlin, little remained of what had once been a vibrant world city. What followed was a period marked by division, reconstruction, and a painful reckoning with the past. The years between 1939 and 1945 left deep scars, not only on the city's walls, but also on its moral and cultural foundation. At the end of this devastating conflict, Berlin emerged as a symbol of collapse, yet also as a place where a new beginning had to be forged. The final days of the war had transformed Berlin into a battleground. As Soviet troops reached the city, fierce fighting erupted over every street and building. Following the capitulation, the city entered a phase of uncertainty and fear. Tens of thousands of people found themselves homeless. The infrastructure lay in ruins, and hunger and disease dictated daily life. Yet, amid the chaos, the first steps toward renewal began to take shape. The victorious powers, the Soviet Union, the United States, Great Britain, and France, took control of the city. Berlin was divided into 4 occupation zones, each administered by one of the Allied powers. The eastern part fell under Soviet control, while the western districts were allocated to the Americans, British, and French. Initially intended as a temporary arrangement, this division laid the groundwork for the separation that would define the city's fate for decades to come. From the outset, cooperation among the victorious powers proved challenging. Divergent political visions for Germany's future soon led to tensions. While a socialist system based on Soviet models was being established in the East, the Western powers began promoting democratic structures in their respective sectors. Situated in the heart of the Soviet sphere of influence, Berlin became a focal point in the emerging Cold War, symbolizing the ideological divide of the world. Daily life remained characterized by hardship and improvisation. Many buildings were repurposed as makeshift shelters. Children played amidst the rubble, and the so-called rubble women began the arduous task of clearing the city of the war's remnants, stone by stone. Ration cards, a thriving black market, and aid deliveries defined the everyday existence of the people who longed for a semblance of normality. Despite the widespread destruction, an extraordinary will to rebuild began to emerge. Theaters reopened their doors, newspapers resumed publication, and schools restarted classes, often in makeshift facilities and without heating. The people of Berlin were determined to live, work, and hope once again. With the establishment of 2 German states in the year 1949, the division became permanent. Although Berlin remained formally a unified city, it was, in practice, divided, setting the stage for the complex and tumultuous history that lay ahead. The eastern part of Berlin became the capital of the German Democratic Republic, while the western part, surrounded by the Soviet sphere of influence, was granted a special status and remained closely tied to the Federal Republic of Germany. This marked the end of one era for Berlin and the beginning of another. From the rubble of its past, a city emerged that now stood at the front line of 2 contrasting worlds. The conclusion of the war had not only brought an end to the widespread destruction, but also initiated a political division, the scars of which continue to linger to this day. Nevertheless, despite all its wounds, Berlin remained a place of new beginnings, a powerful symbol of the human spirit's resilience to forge a future from the ruins of the past. In the summer of 1961, the face of Berlin changed dramatically. Overnight, the city that had once been the heart of Germany was split in two. On the 13th of August, armed units in the east began to barricade streets, erect barbed wire, and construct concrete walls. Families were torn apart, streets abruptly ended in solid concrete, and an entire city became emblematic of the division of the world. The construction of the Berlin Wall became the most visible symbol of the Cold War, a physical and emotional barrier that would shape generations to come. The backdrop to this development was the deepening political and economic divide that had grown since the end of the war. In the preceding years, millions of people had fled the East, seeking refuge in the West in search of freedom, better living conditions, and opportunities for the future. The exodus of skilled workers, doctors, and academics significantly weakened the economy in the East. To halt this outflow, the leadership in the East decided to close the border to the western side of Berlin. What was referred to as an anti-fascist protective wall was, in reality, a structure of confinement. Within a matter of days, the city was sliced by barbed wire and walls. Border crossings were blocked, and friends, neighbors, and families could no longer see one another. Potsdamer Platz, once a bustling center, transformed into a desolate zone of concrete, watchtowers, and death strips. For the people of Berlin, the construction of the wall was a profound shock. In the West, reactions ranged from outrage to helplessness, while in the East fear and resignation prevailed. Many attempted to escape despite the formidable security measures in place. Some were successful, while many faced tragic outcomes. The wall quickly became a symbol of human tragedy. Border guards, escape tunnels, balloon flights, and desperate leaps from windows on Bernauer Strasse captured global attention. Politically, the wall solidified the division of Europe. Berlin became a focal point of international tensions, a stage for symbolic gestures and political speeches. Simultaneously, it remained a bastion of isolation for the East, a place where control over the populace took on a visible form. Life on either side of the wall began to diverge increasingly. While West Berlin, bolstered by the support of Western allies, transformed into a vibrant yet enclosed island, daily life in the East was dominated by surveillance and a struggling economy. Two systems, two worlds, and two starkly contrasting realities existed merely meters apart. Over the years, the wall became an integral part of the cityscape, serving as a constant reminder of the oppression and political tensions of the era. Tourists from around the globe flocked to see it, this cold, gray structure that had become a symbol of a global confrontation. Yet, despite its harshness, the wall could never completely suppress the human yearning for freedom. Letters, clandestine meetings at the border crossings, music, and art kept alive the memory of what once was shared. Behind concrete and barbed wire, hope persisted that this division would not last forever. The 13th of August marked a day when a city was torn apart. The wall not only separated streets and families, but became a visible manifestation of an era where two ideologies stood in irreconcilable opposition. Yet, it was precisely in this place, where the division was most evident, that the call for unity would later resonate the loudest. The autumn of 1989 marked a pivotal moment that would forever alter the fate of Berlin and all of Europe. After nearly 3 decades of division, the people rose against the wall, against the silence and control that had dictated life in the East. Remarkably, this uprising occurred without violence, without tanks, and without gunfire, leading to the fall of a structure that had symbolized oppression for millions. The fall of the wall became an emotional explosion for an entire century, a moment when history became tangible and visible. Months prior, the atmosphere in the East had begun to shift. Brave citizens demanded reforms, freedom, and the right to travel. Peaceful protest movements formed in churches, public squares, and factory halls. Cities like Leipzig, Dresden, and eventually East Berlin became the focal points for the so-called Monday demonstrations. Daily, the pressure on the political leadership intensified, especially as neighboring countries in the East, particularly Hungary and Poland, began to open their borders, causing the old bloc to start crumbling. On the evening of the 9th of November, the unimaginable occurred. A vague announcement from a government spokesperson regarding new travel regulations spread like wildfire. Thousands of people surged toward the border crossings, uncertain if they were truly allowed to pass. The border guards, overwhelmed and lacking clear orders, finally opened the barriers. People from east and west embraced each other in tears, danced on the wall, and exchanged bottles of sparkling wine amidst the flood of emotions. On that fateful night, a border that had seemed insurmountable for nearly 30 years vanished. Berlin became the stage for one of the most moving events of the 20th century. The city, long a symbol of division, transformed into a beacon of hope and reunification. Images of jubilant crowds at the Brandenburg Gate spread across the globe. Strangers embraced one another as friends, and neighbors became like family. Those families who had been separated for decades found themselves reunited. However, the fall of the wall was not merely an emotional moment. It marked the beginning of a profound transformation. Within just a few months, the process of political, economic, and social reunification commenced. The East opened up. Institutions were merged, and roads, railways, and networks were reconnected. Berlin faced the monumental challenge of reconstituting itself from two cities back into one. The initial years following 1989 were characterized by both excitement and uncertainty. Euphoria mingled with skepticism, and hope coexisted with fear. The differences that had developed between East and West over the decades could not be bridged overnight. Yet the direction was clear. Berlin was destined to become one again, serving as the heart of a new, united Germany. The fall of the wall represented more than the collapse of a structure made of concrete and barbed wire. It symbolized a victory of courage over fear, truth over lies, and freedom over control. In that November night, a divided city transformed into a symbol of reconciliation. The Berliners, who had been separated by walls for so long, demonstrated to the world that even the most formidable barriers could fall when people believe in freedom. Thus began a new chapter in Berlin's history, a chapter that taught the city that its greatest strength lay not in power or wealth, but in its unwavering will to start a new time and again. With German reunification in the year 1990, Berlin entered a new phase, one that would ultimately restore the city to its former role while simultaneously presenting entirely new challenges. For the first time since 1945, Berlin was once again the undivided heart of Germany. The wall had fallen, the borders were open, and the city faced the task of reinventing itself as the capital of a democratic united nation. Initially, it was unclear whether Berlin would indeed reclaim its status as the seat of government. Bonn, the provisional capital of the post-war period, had evolved over the decades of division into a well-ordered, tranquil center of West German politics. Many politicians and citizens feared that a move to the bustling, rebuilding Berlin could reopen old wounds. However, the symbolic power of the city outweighed any political caution. With the Bundestag's decision in 1991, the choice was made clear. The government and parliament would return to Berlin. This decision marked the beginning of a profound reconstruction, shaping the future of the capital and the nation. Not only did the cityscape change, but so too did the self-understanding of the nation. Where the Berlin Wall once stood, new squares, streets, and buildings emerged. The Reichstag building, which had long served as a symbol of division, underwent extensive restoration and was topped with a glass dome, representing transparency and openness in the newly established democracy. The Platz der Republik, which had been a barren wasteland for years, was revitalized and transformed into the political heart of Germany. Ministries, embassies, and government buildings began to cluster in this area, and the government district along the Spree River evolved into a new emblem of unity. Culturally and socially, Berlin began to pulsate with life. People from both East and West, long-time residents and newcomers alike, artists, students, and entrepreneurs flocked to the city. The reunified Berlin became a testing ground for a new generation that sought to blend the old with the new. The vacant lots of the former border areas were transformed into studios, clubs, and event venues that reshaped the city's identity. However, the path to unity was fraught with challenges. Economic disparities between East and West, differing realities of life, and contrasting political mentalities led to tensions. The process of reconstruction, as it was termed, required patience, investment, and mutual understanding. Despite all these challenges, the direction was unmistakable. Berlin was to reclaim its status as the political, intellectual, and emotional center of the nation. With the return of the Bundestag and the federal government, this aspiration became a reality. Berlin resumed the role it had played in the 19th century as a site of decision-making, debate, and national identity. Yet, unlike before, this capital was no longer merely a city of power. It had transformed into a city of diversity and openness, a metropolis that acknowledged its past while striving to shape its future. The 3rd of October 1990, the day of reunification, became more than just a political date in Berlin. It was a moment imbued with profound symbolism. At the Brandenburg Gate, where barbed wire and watchtowers once stood, hundreds of thousands celebrated the unity of a country that had learned to forge community from division. Thus, Berlin once again became the capital, but not out of triumph. Rather, it emerged from experience. A city that had endured wars, division, and rebirth became a reflection of a new Germany, free, democratic, and cosmopolitan. The return of the government was more than a mere administrative step. It represented the culmination of a historical cycle that brought Berlin back to the central role it had always been destined to occupy in Germany's history. Today, Berlin is a city that continually reinvents itself, a metropolis that intertwines past and present, memory and renewal. At first glance, it is loud, diverse, and sometimes contradictory. Yet, it is precisely in these contrasts that its strength lies. Berlin is not only the political capital of Germany, but also a vibrant cultural laboratory, a place brimming with ideas and transformation. The traces of its rich history are visible at every turn. Amidst modern glass facades, one can find ruins, monuments, and reconstructed buildings that tell stories of centuries past, of the splendor of the imperial era, of war and division, of hope and renewal. Landmarks such as the Brandenburg Gate, the Reichstag, Museum Island, and the Berlin Wall Memorial serve as more than mere tourist attractions. They are symbols of a collective memory that shapes and carries the city. Here, history is not confined to museums. It lives on the streets, in the structures, and within the very people of Berlin. At the same time, Berlin is a city of youth and creativity. Following the reunification of Germany, it became a magnet for artists, musicians, architects, and thinkers from around the globe. Abandoned factories were transformed into galleries, clubs, and studios, evolving into cultural free spaces. In those years, a thriving scene emerged, establishing Berlin as one of the most creative cities in Europe. To this day, it continues to attract individuals seeking freedom, self-expression, and new ways of life. Berlin thrives on this energy, characterized by a blend of improvisation, courage, and a spirit of experimentation. Economically, the city has also undergone significant transformation. After years of upheaval, Berlin is now a hub for technology, research, and startups. Companies from the digital and creative sectors are establishing their presence here, supported by a young and diverse international population. However, Berlin remains a city that grapples with social challenges as well. Rising rents, gentrification, and the struggle for living space and cultural diversity are pressing issues. Yet, these tensions also reflect the city's dynamic nature, a sign that Berlin is alive and continually evolving. What makes Berlin truly unique is its openness. Here, people from all corners of the world come together. More than 200 nationalities shape the urban landscape. From Kreuzberg to Neukölln, from Prenzlauer Berg to Charlottenburg, one encounters a multitude of languages, lifestyles, and cultures. This diversity ensures that Berlin is never homogeneous but always remains deeply human. Politically, Berlin is once again the heart of Germany. Decisions are made, debates are held, and policies are crafted in close proximity to the very sites where the history of the 20th century unfolded. Yet, despite the concentration of power, Berlin never feels distant or monumental. It remains a city of its citizens, a place of movement and contradiction, sometimes chaotic, often challenging, but always vibrant. Today, Berlin is more than the sum of its history. It is a place where change is palpable, where the past and future intersect. It is a city that has learned that destruction does not signify an end. Rather, it often marks the beginning of something new. Between the facades of the new capital, in the parks, on the squares, and within the voices of its residents, a spirit emerges that has shaped Berlin for centuries. This enduring essence reflects the city's remarkable ability to continually reinvent itself while never losing its soul. It is a testament to resilience and transformation in the face of adversity.